Welcome, everyone. Happy 2021 from all of us here at the Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute. We hope that 2021 will be a safer post-pandemic world. I'm grateful you all joined us today. We have a wonderful array of programming scheduled through the winter and into the spring. And if you use Google and you Google Johns Hopkins Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute, you'll find our homepage, which is a great way to stay in touch with us and learn about upcoming programs. And please feel free to email us directly at bladdercancer@jhmi.edu for specific assistance. During the talk this afternoon, please feel free to use the chat. And Dr. Platz has generously encouraged us to interrupt her if we have questions during the talk. I think she's right, it creates a more dynamic and interactive session that way. But we'll also have an open question session at the end of the talk if you are shy about asking questions in the middle. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Platz. She's a population scientist here at Hopkins. She will tell you more about her expertise, but let me tell you a little bit about her background. She completed her master's in public health at Yale, and then performed both doctoral and postdoctoral work in epidemiology at Harvard. She's now a professor of epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where she serves as deputy chair of the department and a professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, with joint appointments in urology and oncology. She's the Martin D. Abeloff Scholar in Cancer Prevention. And as a population scientist, her work focuses on the molecular and genetic epidemiology of the underpinnings and mechanism underlying prostate cancer progression. And she also knows a lot about a lot of other types of cancer as well. She's committed to finding translation of this work into prevention and treatment strategies, and she serves on the State Council on Cancer Control with our very own Stephanie Greenberg. And so today I'm very excited and very happy that she's going to be sharing her insights around bladder cancer. And so with that, Dr. Platz, take it away.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here with you all today. And I'm going to tell you a bit about cancer and about bladder cancer risk factors. So first point I want to make is that cancer is avoidable in the population. It isn't all bad luck. So what evidence do we have that that is the case? Well, there are lots of kinds of studies that we do in my field called epidemiology. And one of them is surveillance and time trends type studies. So it's long been recognized that there are these profound patterns of differences in cancer occurrence by person, place, and time. So for example, there's older studies looking at migrants from Japan to Hawaii and comparing their cancer risk with those who live within the US, within those who lived within Hawaii. And what was noted, it was those who moved from Japan tended to have higher risks of cancer. I gave an example here of prostate cancer, compared to those who stayed back in Japan, although their risk of cancer was still lower than those who are white living in the mainland of the US. So that tells us when people move, their risks of certain cancers can change. There's also profound differences in geographic occurrence of cancer. So when you look around the world, risk of some cancers are high in some places, low in other places. And then in addition to migrants and looking at geography, we can look at changes over time. So here's an example. These are US rates, contemporary rates of cancer mortality. We can see these very, very steep declines in overall cancer mortality in the US. And this is true both in men and women. So big, big declines over time. And then we have to ask, well, what could be causing these massive changes in cancer risk over time? Well, we note that there are also sometimes really large changes in risk factors. So let's take a look at the explanation for that large decline in cancer mortality in the US. Let's map it to change in a risk factor. So cigarette smoking. So over the past many years, we've had a tremendous decline in cigarette smoking in the US. And that's in part because of policies. And this arose initially after the 1964 Surgeon General's report on smoking and health, where it was clear that smoking is a cause of cancer, including lung cancer. So these profound changes have resulted in major changes in lung cancer. So this curve shows the US consumption of tobacco over time, and then the change in lung cancer death rates in men and in women over time. And you can see that there's an offset in the timing of when lung cancer rates peaked relative to when smoking rates peaked. Okay, so that's the latency period. Okay, of course, it takes a long time for cancer to form after having certain exposures. So continuing on with our theme of cancer is avoidable in the population, it isn't all bad luck. There's additional kinds of research in my field that we do. So I told you about trends over person, place, and time, but there's another style of research that we do, which is called observational epidemiology research, where we attempt to identify associations between modifiable factors and cancer risk. And so now let me tell you about epidemiology. So you have seen it a lot in the news recently because of COVID-19. So what does epidemiology mean? So epidemiology, if you break down the word, the prefix epi means on or besides or after. So epidermis, epidemic, so these are words you all know. Dem for demos, right? Meaning people from Greek. And so we have multiple words that where you see the word dem in it, and ology meaning the study of. And so what is epidemiology? So it's a population science research approach. It is usually observational, and it's complementary to basic science research, which is often experimental and is conducted in cell lines, mouse models, for example. And so what is more specifically the definition of epidemiology? Well, it's the study of the frequency, so how many people are affected, the distribution, so who is affected, and the causes, so why are they affected? So the slides that I showed you so far looked at the frequency and distribution. And so now I'm going to start telling you more about causes, so causes of diseases and conditions in the population. And so by population, what do I mean? Well, you'll hear me talk about study population. So those are the people actually enrolled in the study that's aiming to identify the relationship between an exposure and an outcome like cancer or like bladder cancer. The source population, those are the people from whom you identify your study population. And then there's the target population. So those are the people we want to actually prevent the disease in. And so it could be the global population, it could be the US population, it could be women, it could be postmenopausal women. So we study some people, but we're trying to infer to this larger population. So how do we actually go about doing this? Well, the field of epidemiology encompasses design and the analytical methods to investigate disease risk, including cancer in human populations. And it's a very flexible method. We can address a wide variety of hypotheses in biomedical research. And how do we do it? Well, testing a hypothesis involves comparing the risk of the disease in two or more groups that differ on the hypothesized cause of that disease. So we have the exposed group, we have the unexposed group. We follow them forward in time to figure out who has the higher risk of disease. Okay, so that's our general approach. And then just a few more concepts I want to go through. So the concept of risk. Now we all have an inherent sense of what risk is, but really it's a population level math calculation. So we have our numerator, how many new cases of the disease were diagnosed, the denominators, how many people are at risk, so the size of the population, and it's expressed as a percentage. So it could be expressed as a proportion, or you might see 1 in 5 people. So just a very simple math problem. But risk is actually a more complicated concept because it doesn't apply to individual people. It's a population concept. So risk is, an individual can't ask the question, what's my risk? Because for any given person over your lifetime, either you do or don't have whatever the disease is. But you can answer the following question. So for example, someone might ask, doctor, what is the risk of cancer for people like me? And so it could be 100 people like you, the risk of cancer is X% over time. Also important to know is that when we think about risk of disease, you have to specify the time or the age period over which you want to know the likelihood of that disease. And so, for example, if you want to know what's the risk of death, the lifetime risk is 100%. Everybody dies in the end. The risk of death from age 20 to age 85 is 57.2%. And that's given that you've lived to age 20. Or you might want to know, what's the risk of death over the next 10 years starting at age 50? Well, the answer is 3.6%, given that someone has lived to age 50. And I should point out, these are real data, but they are pre-COVID-19 data. Okay, 2017 is the most recent data available from the National Center for Health Statistics for doing these kinds of calculations. Okay, so again, the point I'm trying to make here is risk is a population level concept. It's not an individual level concept. All right, so now let's look at lifetime risk of cancer, including bladder cancer. So the lifetime probability, that means the lifetime risk of developing cancer in males is 1 in 2 in the US. And for bladder cancer, it's 1 in 26. Okay, so that means the lifetime risk of bladder cancer in men is about 3.8%. In women, the lifetime risk of cancer is 1 in 3. And bladder cancer is not one of the top 10 cancers for women. So this information is not typically published. So now let's look at incidence and mortality rates. And so in the US, bladder cancer is a top 10 cancer in men. And so we can take a look at the pattern over time. So bladder cancer risk has been sort of flat, maybe going up a little bit. And then roughly in the mid to later 2000s, it looks like there's a bit of a decline. Again, this is incidence rates of bladder cancer in US males. Now, this pattern is distinctly different from other major cancers in the US. So prostate, we have this weird pattern related to prostate cancer screening. Lung cancer has been declining because of smoking, as we discussed. Colon cancer has similarly declined, possibly due to greater uptake of colonoscopy, but possibly also because of reductions in smoking. But oddly, bladder has not changed very much over time, except for this more recent decline. You can also see there's some other cancers with increasing risks or rates rather, and these are related to other kinds of exposures going on in the population. So if we take a look at the rates, rather looking at the counts for bladder cancer, we expect in 2020 a much higher number of new cases of bladder cancer in men compared to women. So that's long been known that men have a higher risk of bladder cancer than women. And the same thing for death. And then instead, if we look at rates instead of the counts, we get a very clear sense of the much higher likelihood, in this case it's a rate, of bladder cancer in men compared with women. And that's true also for mortality. And by the way, I've given some references. Typically, these are websites. These are authoritative websites if you have interest in looking up some of these data. Okay, as I said, epidemiology is very often in the news, although you may not recognize it as being this style of research because the name epidemiology isn't often in the headline. But I think with COVID-19, again, you do hear the word epidemiology much more often. Okay, and then to give you an example of, and this is not bladder, but I'm leading up to bladder in just a moment, of a kind of research that allows us to understand the avoidability of cancer and actually to quantify it. And so this style of research is still epidemiology, but it's attempting to say, if we know what the risk factors are, and we know how strongly those risk factors are associated with our cancer, if we removed these exposures from the population, how much of that cancer might we be able to avoid? So I've told you cancer is avoidable, so let's talk about what these estimates might be. And so for colon cancer, this is a study we did way back in the year 2000, and we estimated if the population did not have the risk factors, so obesity, inactivity, smoking, alcohol, red meat, and low folic acid intake, if these levels went away, these risk factors went away, how much colon cancer could we prevent? And the estimate that we came up with was 71%. And I'm going to show you in a little bit for bladder cancer, making some small changes could also reduce the burden of bladder cancer in the population. And I'll show you what those estimates are. All right, and so why do we want to identify causes? We use epidemiology as a way to point to some risk factors. And then through a method called causal inference, I'll show you in just a moment, we determine which factors may actually be causally related to the development of disease, in this case, cancer and bladder cancer. So we want to identify causes because causes become the basis for preventive action that individuals can take. You can quit smoking, for example, and they also become the basis for societal action. That is developing guidelines, policies, regulations, and laws to help minimize our exposure to factors that cause cancer. So what's our process? Well, we often will couple epidemiology with this process called causal inference. And so authoritative bodies that tell us that certain factors cause cancer use this process. So first, there is the development of evidence. So you have observations of people living in groups. This is our epidemiology set of work. There's human experiments, so trials, and other styles of research, basic science. All of this evidence gets synthesized together through systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and other kinds of strategies. And then there are experts who are brought together to make an expert judgment. And they use a set of causal criteria in their evaluation. And then based on this whole process together, causal inference is done. And so based on the evidence, based on criteria for causality, we together as a group of authoritative experts can draw conclusions about the causes of cancer. So this process is used by the US Surgeon General in the reports that they produce, for example, on smoking. So here's the 2014 report. I mentioned the 1964 report, so this was 50 years later, and they went through this process to review the evidence for smoking as a cause of many cancers that in the past we thought weren't related. And then even they do reports on smoking cessation. So they go through the same process of causal inference to be able to come to their conclusions about whether factors are a cause of cancer or causes of other problems for human health. So when you think about what you see in the news, remember I told you epidemiology is in the news daily, think about how you might approach yourself thinking through whether what you're hearing makes sense and whether it's likely that, when you hear coffee causes this cancer, coffee prevents that cancer. Think about what you're hearing and think about these criteria for causality. So you want to think through, does the exposure come before the outcome? So for something to cause cancer, it has to come before cancer. Is there some biologically plausible mechanism that could explain the observed association between the exposure and cancer? How strong is that association? How consistent is it among studies, including epidemiologic studies? And when you hear this in the news or you're looking on social media, ask these above questions and see if what you're hearing makes sense. Okay, and then a couple more definitions. So what's a modifiable cause of cancer? And what do I mean by exposure? So modifiable are factors that individual people or society can change themselves to reduce the impact on cancer. And so I mentioned already, people can quit smoking, so they can take actions themselves to make some changes. So they're modifiable causes. And then society taking action, again, we can make our laws, we can have regulations, for example, indoor air regulations banning smoking indoors. We can have laws that give rise to policies, for example, coverage of HPV vaccination. So HPV is a liver cancer cause. So we can have coverage of HPV vaccination without copay, for example. Okay, and then what are exposures? So exposures that are important causes of disease are the ones that, as I mentioned, are determined through that process of causal inference. All right, so now moving on to actual risk factors. So which factors are the greatest cancer causes and are modifiable? So back in 1981, Sir Richard Dahl and Sir Richard Peto performed an analysis to estimate the proportion of cancer that is attributable to certain exposures in the population. And this was work in developed countries. So recall I just showed you an example for colon cancer specifically. So they did this work a long time ago for cancer overall. And what they identified was that about 30% of cancers in the population are caused by tobacco use. And another 35% are caused by the combination of diet, obesity, and inactivity. Now, much more recently, estimates have been produced, and still the top factor contributing to cancer in the population is tobacco, followed by excess body weight and alcohol. Now, what's interesting is because the prevalence of tobacco has dropped so much in the US population, the proportion of cancer risk that's due to tobacco smoking has dropped. So it used to be about 30%, and now it's under 20%. All right, so why do we care about smoking so much? People are tired of hearing the message that smoking is bad for you, smoking causes cancer, but it is by far and away the most important risk factor it's causal, that we have for cancer. So in this 2014 Surgeon General's report, they estimated how many cancers, smoking-related cancers, population since the 1964 Surgeon General's report. So if everyone had stopped smoking, these deaths would have been avoided. So about 6.6 million people were estimated to have died of a smoking-related cause. And then another 260-some thousand people were estimated to have died of lung cancer because they were exposed to secondhand smoke. So they weren't active smokers. Their lung cancer was caused by someone else's smoking. Taking a look now at the number of cancers that are caused by smoking. And of course, bladder is one of the important ones among them. So smoking is bad, the only way to put it.
So
All right.
Elizabeth,
Yes,
we have
yeah,
a question.
sure.
So John Bordeaux
Absolutely.
is wondering, have there been controlled studies regarding what behaviors can reduce the recurrence of bladder tumors or result in less harmful ones?
Yes, that is a great question. Researchers are attempting to do those kinds of studies. We don't have answers for you yet. And so it's so important what you're asking. About 10 years ago, there became a stronger focus in understanding what modifiable factors, meaning ones people have control over, could be changed to reduce the likelihood of recurrence in people who have cancer and death from cancer. And that was overall. The biggest focus was on breast and prostate cancers. And in fact, there were trials done looking at changes in weight through programs, increasing physical activity. For bladder, we're not there yet. So important areas of focus. Now, certainly quitting smoking would be important. So if someone has bladder cancer, just for any cancer, if someone still smokes, they should quit smoking. There's no question about that. And if someone has bladder cancer or has any cancer, if they have too much weight, losing weight is important, because it's not just about recurrence, preventing recurrence. You also want to prevent premature mortality. I think at this moment in time where we don't have answers for you specific to bladder and specific to reducing recurrence, the idea of following guidelines for good health in general is actually quite an important strategy. So thank you for that question. I wish I had more information for you. Okay. All right. So on to smoking. Prevalence of smoking in the US. I just want you to remember that there have been tremendous declines in smoking in both men and women. But what we still have in the US is a profound difference in who still smoke. So people who have a college education or who have a graduate education have a much lower prevalence of smoking than those who have less education. So this is true in men, it's true in women. Okay, so the message needs to be targeted. This would also help us to reduce bladder cancer in the population. Okay, the next exposure I'd like to talk to you about is obesity. So obesity is highly prevalent in the population and is now thought to be a cause of 15 cancers, possibly including bladder cancer. So this is one I think most people don't think very much about. Smoking, most people know about as a cause of bladder cancer, but it also seems to be a risk factor, if not a cause of bladder cancer. And I have some references for you here if you'd like to look them up and learn more about it. And so our epidemic of obesity continues to be a problem here in the US. It's also a problem around the world. What's shown on the right are national data by state. The states that are in this darkest red color are the ones that have a very high proportion of their population who are obese. Colorado is the state that has the lowest proportion of obese individuals, but it's still high. So in the US overall, we have more than 30% of the population is obese. In Colorado, it's between 20 and 25% of the population. All right, so those are two big risk factors for cancer in general, and they're also risk factors for bladder cancer.
So
So
Elizabeth, I have
yes, yeah,
another question for you
sure.
from
Yeah,
Karen Sass. So
yeah.
what about vaping?
Oh, very good question. Okay, so right now we do not know whether vaping increases the risk of cancer. Vaping is a delivery tool for nicotine. That nicotine is still derived from tobacco. The materials that are in the cartridge that contains the nicotine does contain chemicals that make it make the fluid vaporize more readily. The tool often will through the heating process often can produce metal fumes. So there are concerns about effects on the lungs from the process of vaping and the components of the nicotine cartridge itself. But at this time, we do not know if there is an increased risk of cancer, whether it's lung cancer, the direct effect on the lungs, or cancer elsewhere in the body. But certainly inhaling anything into the lungs other than clean air around us is not optimal for lung health. I do not have any information on whether vaping has any relationship to cancer or any other health effects in other organs of the body, including the bladder. So thank you for that question. Okay, great.
So one more
Yes,
question.
sure.
What if you never smoked, but your parent did until he or she
Mm,
died? Yeah.
yeah, so secondhand smoke is not good, right? So it's actually a different exposure, smoking exposure than active smoking. So in active smoking, you're inhaling through the filter at one end. Through secondhand smoke, you're actually getting the burning product at the other end. So it actually has a slightly different composition. It is well recognized that people who are exposed to secondhand smoke, especially sort of long term, so many hours of the day, long term over many years. Flight attendants, for example, households where back in the old days, let's say in the U.S., and this is still true in other parts of the world, where if there were a husband and wife, the husband was a smoker and the wife was not. If you have a population like that, the women who were exposed to their husbands smoking tended to have a higher risk of lung cancer. Now, for other cancers, it's less clear. It's also less direct. So obviously, when you inhale some of the mutagens directly, cause irritation, inflammation. The mutations can be promoted by the irritation, the inflammation. So that direct effect is what's probably causing the lung cancer in never smokers. But for other cancers, it's much less clear whether there's a higher risk for that exposure. So it's an important question. Some people think the current increased risk of lung cancer in never smoking women in the U.S. may be in fact due to that problem. So that's a very good question. Okay, but for bladder, I don't think there's enough evidence at this moment, one way or another. So thank you for that. Okay, great. And David, keep interrupting. I think that's terrific. Makes it much more interesting for people to get their answers, their questions answered.
I will.
All right. So cancer. Yeah, great. So I've been talking very much about risk factors, but let's flip it around and talk about prevention for a moment. So there's the concept of primary prevention. So that means you prevent the cancer by either preventing the exposure that causes the cancer in the first place, or you intervene on an exposure somebody already has that's a risk factor for cancer. So some good examples of that are quitting smoking or vaccinating against HPV, HBV, banning tanning beds for young people to reduce their risk to ultraviolet light and therefore melanoma and other kinds of skin cancer. So another strategy that's been thought about quite a bit is the use of medications to prevent cancer. And that's known as chemoprevention. So it can be medications, it can be other kinds of pills, vitamins, minerals, and so on. So I just want to remind you that while that sounds like such a great strategy, medications almost always have adverse effects. And when you're trying to prevent, say, cancer in a population, that means large numbers of people would have to take that drug. And if there are always going to be some kind of side effects, even if it has a low likelihood, across an entire population, that could actually result in quite a number of people having that adverse effect. So for a long time, we were attempting to think about aspirin, low-dose aspirin, as a strategy to reduce cancer, in particular colorectal cancer. And in fact, it was shown in several trials that lower dose aspirin does prevent colon cancer. But the problem is that it causes GI and brain bleeds. And so across the population, you can have lots of extra people who have these unfortunate side effects. So that means that even though we know that aspirin can prevent colorectal cancer, it's not currently recommended. Okay. And even taking vitamins and minerals at higher dose can cause adverse effects. There were 2 randomized trials that used high levels of beta carotene, right? That's the carotenoid that makes carrots that orangey color. So at very high dose, placebo-controlled trials, use of that high dose beta carotene resulted in increased lung cancer risk. Okay, so even vitamin and minerals at high dose may not be perfectly safe. So we do use chemoprevention as a strategy to reduce the risk of cancer in people who have a high risk of cancer. So for them, the risk ratio, so the benefit to risk ratio, is in the positive direction. So a good example of this is the use of selective estrogen receptor modulators in women with BRCA1/2 mutations to reduce their risk of breast cancer. Our attention. So what we need to do is emphasize cancer risk factors that are also risk factors for other common diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And so the good examples of those happen to be smoking and obesity. And doing this will allow us to have non-siloed responsibility across the prevention and control spectrum that helps us to avoid duplication of efforts and expenditures and creates a seamless model for population health and public health efforts. What we need to do is de-emphasize controversial factors, because there's always something in the news that you hear about, ooh, this will work, try this herb, try that thing, right? Controversial factors are probably not the right strategy, and avoid quick fixes like magic pills. Okay, so I just want to set the framework for what I'm about to tell you. So here we are, finally on to bladder cancer. So I want to make the point back to risk. The reason why I went through all that stuff at the beginning was to be able to make certain points too. So one is, we cannot say for certain whether a particular person's bladder cancer resulted from a particular exposure. Okay, because risk, even for modifiable causes, is a population, not an individual concept. So we can say on average in a population, this factor is a cause of bladder cancer, but we cannot say for any given person that a certain exposure caused their bladder cancer. And then there's this other important concept, which is that cancer usually requires multiple factors together to produce the damage that then results in the likelihood of a cancer. And that could be the combination of exposures, modifiable factors, but it also probably is interacting with inherent factors, so meaning genetics, to produce cancer. Okay, so we can't tell you what caused any given person's bladder cancer, and it's probably not just one thing anyway. It's probably multiple things together that that increase the risk and produce that outcome. All right, so what are the modifiable causes or risk factors that are associated with an increased
So
risk of
Elizabeth,
bladder
can I interrupt
cancer?
you? So
Yeah,
we have a
yes,
couple of
sure.
questions around medical marijuana. So
Oh, yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So what about smoking medical marijuana? Is there any evidence that that would increase your risk of bladder cancer?
Yeah. So view marijuana for a moment as just another organic material that can be burned. Okay, so if you think about it that way, and you put it in the same context as tobacco, then marijuana in the same way that tobacco is usually smoked, meaning a lot. I'm not talking about take away the effects of, like, for example, the THC and the nicotine from my story. Just focus on the burning organic material part of it for a moment. If someone smokes marijuana in the same way to the same extent, I would be concerned. We don't have evidence for this, but I would be concerned that there could be an increased risk of cancers that are like the ones that cigarette smoke causes. Okay, we don't have evidence because we've never had large enough population-based studies with long-term follow-up. Okay, the classic studies that that proved that tobacco is a cause of cancer were very large prospective cohort studies, where it was very clear who was smoking cigarettes, how much they were smoking, and for how long, and they were followed for more than 50 years. We don't have that kind of study for marijuana use, including for medical marijuana use. So it's a very good question. We don't have an answer.
And a couple people are interested in what about if you take it another way, if you eat it?
Yeah. That's a good question. So I am not aware of evidence showing that consumed marijuana changes risk of cancer one way or another.
Right. So we've got a couple people asking about gummy bears. The answer would be we don't know, but doesn't wait, stay tuned.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
then Karen Godfrey wants to know, are there any studies which show the effects of traumatic stress and then developing cancer without other causal effects present in the study?
Yeah, well, that's a very, very good question.
I think Karen means emotional stress. I'm not sure.
It will stress in general. So it could be, some people have financial toxicity. We have growing up in households where there's maybe violence in the household. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that stress can come about. And it's actually very hard to study stress and cancer risk because of the problem of measurement. How do you measure the extent of stress, and then how do you relate it to biological pathways? So at this time, if you look at authoritative sources on the causes of cancer, the type of stress that you're asking about is not listed as a known cause of cancer. That doesn't mean that it's not somehow contributing. What we need are better measures of stress that would help us to resolve the question that you're asking about.
That may be where wearables come in someday. So
absolutely.
So John and Claire Pitzer would like to know what percentage of cancer cases can be associated with causal factors, environmental exposures, for example, as opposed to inherent genetic factors.
That's great. So I'm going to actually show you an answer to that question in just a moment. And I think you'll be surprised how large that estimate is. Okay, so I'll show that in just a moment.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So here on this this slide are the modifiable causes or risk factors for an increased risk of bladder cancer. So we talked about smoking, obesity. We talked about diabetes is a possible risk factor for bladder cancer. Another one that there's some fairly good evidence, although it's not considered to be causal yet, is not drinking enough water or fluids in general. And then the other one that we know very well is arsenic. So arsenic at high levels is a cause of bladder cancer. So there are other kinds of exposures that are much less common. For example, there's some occupational exposures. So I'm sure you're aware of exposures to certain chemicals in the workplace, including certain synthetic dyes. There's certain cancer treatments that increase the risk of bladder cancer. And then there's a parasitic worm that we don't have here in the US, but in other locations, schistosomiasis is a known bladder cancer risk factor. Okay, so I already told you about smoking, but let me tell you now about the impact of smoking. And this gets at the question from the last questioner. So smoking is by far and away the #1 cause of bladder cancer in the US. It explains about half of bladder cancers in both men and in women. Those who smoke have 3 or more times the risk, higher risk of bladder cancer than people who never smoked, especially, and here's where the genetics come in, especially for people who inherit genetic mutations or variants that reduce their ability to detoxify certain chemicals that are found in cigarette smoke and that are found in some occupational exposures. Here's another important point. Former smokers remain at higher risk of bladder cancer than never smokers. And this is true even decades later. But nevertheless, if someone smokes, they should quit smoking. Not just for bladder cancer, but for many reasons, they should quit smoking. But for bladder cancer, even though I told you that the risk of bladder cancer remains higher in former smokers than in never smokers, definitely still quit, because the risk will be lower than if someone continued smoking. The U.S. Surgeon General's report says that the evidence is sufficient to infer a causal relationship between smoking and bladder cancer. Okay, so it is a cause of bladder cancer, and that's very clear. Okay, obesity, I mentioned to you, is a likely cause of bladder cancer. It's not as nearly as strong of a factor. So bladder cancer risk may increase about 4.2% for each 5 kilogram per meter square increase in body mass index. So what's that size increase? Well, going from the beginning of overweight to the beginning of the going from the overweight to the beginning of the obese category for BMI is a 5 kilogram per meter square increase. So it's actually a fairly large increase in body mass index. Nevertheless, there is a risk, and given the size of our population, I showed you that a moment ago, that 4.2% increase across a population is a number of people. Okay, so here's the more direct answer to the last person's question. My colleagues did this really interesting study fairly recently, where they took 4 risk factors for cancer in general, 2 of which are bladder cancer risk factors. So smoking, and then you flip it around and let's talk about the never smokers, or people who didn't smoke very much. And let's turn obesity around and talk about it the other way, people who are normal weight or are a little bit overweight, but not into the obesity category, plus physical activity and limited alcohol drinking or none. Okay, so they took people who did everything right on these 4 factors and called them the low risk group. And then they said, let's take people who have the complement, so any one of these or all of them, and call them the high risk group. And then the question was, if everyone in the high risk group moved to the low risk group, how much cancer could we avoid? Okay. And so let me point you right away to bladder. So this the left side of the panel is women and the right side is men. So in women in the US population, about 50% of the bladder cancer risk in the population could be avoided if everybody who has one or more of these the complement of these factors, were to move into having all of these sort of low risk characteristics, not smoking or quitting early on, having a BMI sort of in the normal range up until the midpoint of the overweight range, being active and not drinking much alcohol or no alcohol. 50% of bladder cancer in the population could be avoided in women, and for men, about 60% could be avoided. Pretty remarkable.
So
Now,
Elizabeth, we have
yes.
another slew of questions.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
John Hare would like to know how much water he should drink a day.
I have a slide on that in just a minute. Yep.
Great.
I'll show you in a minute.
And John Bordeaux asks, should we assume smoking includes all forms, including pipes and cigarettes?
Oh, that's a good question. So much of the research is done on cigarettes because they were so common, still are so common. They're easy to count up. People know how many cigarettes and how many packs per day. People who use other tobacco products but don't smoke tend to use them less, although some people use more than one kind of product. In general, burning organic material produces certain kinds of we're going to call them electrophiles that can cause DNA damage, and they also can cause damage that produces an inflammatory response. And so the combination of mutations caused by the electrophiles coupled with that inflammation increases the risk of cancer. So there's less information on other tobacco products, but in general, the U.S. Surgeon General's report puts them all together and says it's burning organic material, it's tobacco, they cause cancer. Okay, so I think that's a clear answer. Any kind of smoking is bad. Yeah.
What about drinking water in plastic bottles where the water became very hot?
Yeah, BPA is what you're worried about there. We do not have strong evidence that BPA is whether or not it is a cause of cancer. I know people were very concerned about it. There was some concern about them being mimicking hormones, sex steroid hormones. The answer there is, if you have worry, then be sure not to use plastic bottles that have BPA. There are plastic containers that are BPA free. There's certain kinds of canned goods that had a lining in that, and the lining had BPA. Most companies, I think, have removed it. And I'm not aware of research that that relates BPA to bladder cancer specifically.
So Michael Gerwertz would like to know, we are increasingly aware of the extent to which mycotoxins exist in our homes and in our food supply.
Mm-hmm.
How significant are they as a contributor to bladder cancer?
So I am not aware of studies in using the epidemiologic approach, the kind of studies that I've been talking about here, that specifically look for bladder. Now, there's clearly evidence of I'm going to get it I have to come up with a name for just 1 second. It is called aspergillus, right? So, what do you call it? I'm completely blanking on it. That aflatoxin, thank you, there we go. Aflatoxin is clearly a cause of liver cancer in some places. So there's precedent for it, but I'm not aware of mycotoxins in particular in bladder cancer.
And then last, and we'll keep going.
Yeah.
Damon Thomas would like to know how race factors in, specifically, black versus white.
Yeah. So for bladder cancer, risk and rates are higher in people who are white compared to people who are black. As I mentioned, there's also a sex difference. So bladder cancer risk is higher in men than in women. We do not know what explains these patterns, despite some study. Now, for cancer in general, there are different patterns. So in general, people who are Black in the US have a higher risk of cancer overall, and several types of cancer, although it's not necessarily for any given cancer, you can't assume that. So for example, the incidence of breast cancer is lower in women who are Black than women who are white, although breast cancer mortality is higher in women who are Black than women who are white. Now, reasons for this, not for breast specifically, but in general, why might there be differences by race? Some of it may be differences in the prevalence of risk factors. Some populations have more exposure to some things than other. It can also be related to quality of care, who's offered screening, who uptakes screening and who doesn't. It could be where you live in the country. People tend to live in certain places, depending on your demographics. And so it could be that there are factors that are specific to certain locations in the country. Are there genetic differences? So we all have the same genes. We might have slight differences in the versions of genes. So there might be limited differences in prevalences of genes that may be related to cancer risk. So a good example of genetic variation that differs by race, but really it's sort of continent of origin, is the ability to metabolize alcohol, ethanol, right? So we know that people who come from Asian countries tend to not be able to metabolize one of the steps in clearing through the metabolism of alcohol. So there are population-specific differences that could also appear to be as racial differences that then relate to cancer risk. So that was sort of a long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you. Yeah, someday we'll get Otis Brawley to talk about this too. He has strong opinions about this.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, and final question. What about caffeine?
Oh, yeah. So at this time, it is based on the evidence, a coffee, and then of course the thing that people care about is the caffeine in the coffee, does not appear to be a risk factor for cancer. There's limited evidence, and it's very limited, that maybe it's beneficial because of not the caffeine part, but other constituents in brewed coffee that are chemicals that may protect against certain cancers. But it's limited evidence. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. There was some really poorly done research about, I don't know, 45 years ago that suggested that coffee increased the risk of bladder cancer. And I say that research was poorly done because it turned out that at the time, just in society, people who drank coffee tended to be smokers, and smokers tended to be people who drank coffee. And so that forced a relationship. So it made it look like coffee was the risk factor for pancreatic cancer, but really it was the difference in smoking. Smoking was the underlying cause. So you have to be careful with what you hear in the news. Epidemiologic studies, typically, because they are observational, typically one doesn't give you the answer. You have to do that process of causal inference that I talked about, where you bring together all the evidence, you go through it, you look for that consistency, you look for the strength of the association, you look for the biological plausibility, you look for that temporality. The exposure has to come first, and then later, and usually there's that long latency that I mentioned, the disease comes later. Okay. So what we were talking about a little bit was the amount of bladder cancer that could be avoided in the population if people didn't smoke and if they had BMI in a more normal range. And so let me show you for mortality. This is bladder cancer mortality. So 30 to 60% of bladder cancer mortality could be avoided in the population if people didn't smoke, or they quit after smoking a little bit, or if they were not obese. Okay, so very important information. This slide here has estimates for the US population, and then it's also showing just prevalences in the high and low risk groups. So the one to look at is the darker bar on these slides. And something to point out, in this particular set of studies, everyone was white. Okay. All right, diabetes. So it looks like it's a risk factor. It's unclear if it's causal. What has been shown so far is that the risk of bladder cancer is about 20% higher in people with diabetes compared to those without diabetes. If this is true, this is incredibly important, because in the US, more than 10% of the US population has diabetes. That's 34.2 million people. Okay, here's the water question. So higher water consumption and consumption of other beverages seems to reduce bladder cancer risk. And this is true for muscle invasive bladder cancer too. This is especially true in smokers. You can imagine people who smoke, those mutagens get into urine, sits in the bladder. The more you drink, the more dilute. Okay, this is true for water and other beverages. So there's not something magical about water. It's true in men and women. And then I have this little note that says, as long as the water source is not arsenic contaminated, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then what's the right daily volume? So there was a question about that. So it's unclear what the right amount is. In the cohort studies that have been conducted on this topic, the comparison was about 2/3 of a gallon or more versus 1/3 of a gallon or less. And so that kind of converts to about 10.5 cups of fluid per day versus 5.5 cups of fluid per day. Okay, that doesn't mean that this is the answer. I'm just telling you what they showed in the study. So my answer to the person who asked the question is, it's unclear what the right volume is, the right daily volume. It's just that more seems to be better than less. Okay, I know that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for something more concrete. The answer is we don't know what the right amount is. Okay, and now onto arsenic. So high levels of exposure to arsenic are clearly a cause of bladder cancer. Now in the US, if you have city water, it's regulated. Okay, so you're not getting exposed to arsenic. Where the problem still occurs is where people have private groundwater wells. Arsenic it's naturally present, and it probably does explain some of the higher risk of bladder cancer in the northeast of the US. And so you can see all up through this part of the US, they have a much higher risk of bladder cancer. Other parts of the country, it's much lower. Around the world, there's some places where they have profoundly high levels of arsenic, and it causes bladder cancer, also causes skin cancer. Okay. How about this one? This one was in the news probably about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, chlorination byproducts. So when you have city water, in quotes, city water, we treat our water with chlorine to reduce bacterial exposure. So the risk of getting sick from bacteria in water, we eliminated in the early 1900s through chlorination. But there is a reaction that can occur between the chlorine and the organic material that tends to be in surface water that we use for our reservoirs. And that reaction produces something called a trihalomethane. In the 1970s, it was recognized this was potentially a problem, so it's been regulated. The level has been regulated since, and the key way that they do that is they reduce the organic material in the water during the water treatment process, and then they chlorinate. And then there's testing to make sure that the levels stay low. Well, it turns out that trihalomethanes are not carcinogenic in animal studies. And we've had this massive decrease in the level of trihalomethanes in our drinking water because of that regulation in the late 70s. And following that, we have not seen a decline in bladder cancer risk. So that suggests that trihalomethanes, these chlorination byproducts, are probably not an important contributor to US bladder cancer incidence. Okay, so that's one you may have been concerned about. All right, so here's the take-home message, and this is including for bladder cancer. So in the US, about 60% of the cancer burden could be avoided by not smoking, and if someone already smokes, quit. That would prevent about 50% of bladder cancer. By being not too heavy, that might also help us prevent bladder cancer. And then for other cancers and cancer overall, not drinking, by here I mean drinking, not drinking alcohol, or drinking in moderation only, and being physically active. And the levels of the factors are for being healthy are not extreme. So we're not saying be emaciated, right? We're talking about being in healthy ranges, okay? And if we all did that, then we would not just reduce bladder cancer and not just reduce cancer overall, but we would also reduce other common chronic diseases in the population, heart disease and diabetes in particular. Okay, I have a number of sources. We can distribute these slides, a number of sources of information. These are authoritative sources. These are not the kinds of things that you might see on Facebook, right? These are done by expert groups, qualified expert groups, or the federal government. And then I did do a podcast with Bill Nelson, our Cancer Center director, last year. So if you want to hear more about what we know about cancer and how those discoveries were made, I recommend you take a look or listen to that if you have time to do it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and in the last few minutes, if there are any
I've got a
additional
few more questions for you.
Sure.
Yeah, so Damon Thomas would like to know, what impact, if any, does sugar have on cancer cells?
Ooh, that's a very good question. So there isn't strong evidence from epidemiologic studies that sugar consumption per se affects cancer risk. But what it does is it increases obesity and it increases the likelihood of diabetes. And both of those in turn increase cancer risk. So drinking sugar sweetened beverages, you don't want to do that. You want to reduce that as much as you can is sort of the answer. Yep.
So Damon would also like to know, is drinking mineral water like Pellegrino or Perrier, what impact does that have on bladder cancer? Oh,
so that one I hadn't thought about. You know, those beverages are not going to contain arsenic, even if it's mineral water. So I think it's just a nice source of fluid. It's enjoyable. And, you know, it increases your fluid intake. So it's probably a good thing rather than a bad thing.
And then Brad Messenger would like to know, do any risk factors relate more to low versus high grade bladder cancer?
So, you know, that's actually a really important question. And most studies don't have the power to distinguish between risk factors for low versus high grade bladder cancer. Those studies have to be done as consortial studies. And so as more and more research is done, eventually all those studies can be put together to try to get a good answer for you on that one. But right now it's not clear.
We just had another question come in. So we've got one, does eliminating the risk factors give you a better outcome if you have bladder cancer?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think earlier we were talking about, are there risk factors specifically for outcomes in people with bladder cancer? And the answer is that we don't have clarity right now. And so you're asking the flip side of that question. And so following recommendations for good health in general is probably the right thing to do until we do have good evidence for you.
And what about artificial sweeteners?
Oh, great question. So back in the 70s, there were some studies looking at saccharin, and those studies, I'm talking about animal studies now, found an increased risk of a certain kinds of cancer in certain gendered mice. And I'll tell you the answer in a moment. And based on those studies, it was thought that saccharin caused cancer. But then on re-review of those studies, it turned out that it was bladder cancer, and only in male animals, male rats. So in the final conclusion was that saccharin does not cause human cancer. There's no evidence from all the studies done over the years, even though in that one case of mice or rats, whichever it was bladder cancer, but it was only males. Yeah.
Damon Thomas would like to know, are there studies showing the effectiveness of BCG treatment on blacks relative to whites?
Oh, so that's a really good question. So that's a clinical question. So I don't do research on cancer treatment. So I don't have an answer for you on that one. Is that something, David, you would have an answer to?
Yeah, we'd like to know the answer to that, Damon. We just need to do more purposeful studies, which is why with our Precision Medicine Center of Excellence, we're collecting data intentionally, because a lot of times when we go backward in time, we don't have all the information we'd like to have. So it's in progress. Any other questions? Well, Elizabeth, I want to thank you for a fantastic talk and an animated discussion. And thank you for letting us interrupt you. I think you're right. It did create a much more organic presentation, a lot more fun.
Yeah.
And we look forward to seeing you again in the near future.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your questions. Those were really tremendous. Have a good
Okay.
evening.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.